I was given a great introduction. I'll start over again. Hi, my name is Butch Canerney. I am the Chief of Marketing and Outreach for the National Flood Insurance Program. We are part of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and we've been part of FEMA since 1977 when FEMA was first created by President Carter. And prior to that, the flood insurance program was actually organized in Congress back in 1968 after a series of fairly catastrophic floods that really highlighted the need for a flood insurance program. Flood insurance actually started being excluded from a lot of homeowners policies in the 1930s and 40s. And it took 10 or 12 years for Congress to finally agree on what a national flood insurance program would look like. And so the NFIP was formed actually in the Housing and Urban Development Department back in 1968. With me, I've got an esteemed panel, and you can't see everybody, unfortunately, online, but you can see it in the little picture there. Jason Hunter is my colleague from our Atlanta office in Region 4, and he is the branch chief of floodplain management and insurance. So he's the frontline guy for all of our Region 4 states. Caitlin Connor is, her picture is not up top, but she is with us on the phone, and she's the flood strategy coordinator for Johnson & Johnson Incorporated. Mark Friedlander is the director of corporate communications from the Insurance Information Institute. If you're not familiar with the Insurance Information Institute, they are the data gathering organization for all the major insurance companies nationwide. And Mark can tell you a little bit more about what he does there. And then finally, Marcus Coleman works as a contractor, and he's in charge of partnerships for the National Flood Insurance Program and for our contractor. Give you a little introduction to me. I have been at FEMA since 2004. I thought it would be a great career choice to move to FEMA immediately before 4 hurricanes hit Florida pretty much simultaneously. I've got I realize it's about a 23-year history talking about natural hazards. I've worked for the states of Maryland and Delaware. Shout outs to those guys, as well as the Geological Survey. And like I say, I've been involved at FEMA since 2004 and been involved at the flood program pretty much that entire time. I want to give you a couple numbers about flood insurance, just for those of you who are fairly new to the topic. There are about 5 million flood insurance policies in force nationally. We are in every state, every territory, every tribal nation. We are actually in more than 23,000 participating communities nationwide. We cover $1.3 trillion in assets, all against flood. About 95% of our policies are residential, and about 5% of our policies are non-residential, which could be commercial, could be a church, could be a school, could be a variety of things. Give you a little bit about what we do as far as annual business. Last year was a fairly quiet year. So far this year, first off, I'll start there. So far this year, we have had 3,143 claims. But believe it or not, for 3,000, a little bit more than 3,000 claims, we paid out about $44 million already just in 2020. And you thought, well, there hasn't been a lot of flooding. Remember that we do not require a federal disaster declaration to be called a flood. We jokingly refer to it as wherever 2 or more are gathered. So wherever 2 or more properties that are wet, that are normally dry, are gathered, they're both covered by flood insurance, then you have a flood. In 2019, which was a fairly quiet year, we had 35,004 claims, and we paid out $1.47 billion in flood insurance losses. 2018, which was getting to be a busier year, we had 42,500 claims and $1.53 billion. But I want to give you a couple numbers that really jumped out at me. Interestingly enough, Hurricane Florence, 2018, 16,000 claims at $737 million. That's just from one storm. But this is the one that really jumped out at me. And I worked on this storm last year in Texas. This was Tropical Storm Imelda. Remember, this was a tropical storm. This was not a hurricane. And this was a fairly low-level tropical storm as far as storms go. But we still had 11,314 claims, 11,000 claims, and we paid out $738 million on those claims. So the flood insurance program is obviously very active. Extraordinary service that we provide. And so we want to tell you a little bit about it and tell you a little bit about not only the National Flood Insurance Program, but also a relatively new opportunity that's available to an awful lot of folks, the private flood market. That's a growing market, and so we want to tell you all a little bit about that. But more than anything else, we specifically want to stress how important it is for people to be insured against flood damage and what kinds of things that you can do as whether or not you're a local emergency manager or a VOAD or a floodplain manager or whatever role you have. We want to tell you a little bit about talking to your constituencies and your communities about flood. So with that, I am going to start with our first question, and I'm going to throw it off to Caitlin, Mark, and Jason. And let's start simple. And in case some of our audience doesn't know a lot about flood insurance, let's talk about why flood insurance. Mark, do you want to hit that one first?
Sure, absolutely. One of the things we always stress at the Insurance Information Institute, Butch, is flood insurance is not part of any other policy. Many homeowners, especially in hurricane-prone states like Florida, think they are well covered because they have property protection, they have hurricane wind protection, but your standard homeowner's policy does not include flood. It's a separate policy, and you need that coverage for any damage. The way we kind of describe it is water damage from the ground up. Top down usually will be covered under a property policy, such as water leaking through a roof from a storm, but water that comes from the ground up and floods your home, that requires flood insurance. And you talked about Imelda, the bigger storm, of course, in Texas before then was Harvey, and we saw 3/4 of the flood losses from Harvey. Over 200,000 homes were destroyed from Harvey. 3/4 of those homes did not have flood coverage. And it's so essential. And you talk about, okay, well, that's a once in a 100-year storm, right? Well, 2 years later, as Butch just referred to, you have Imelda, another massive storm with thousands and thousands of flood claims and damage beyond what you normally would consider from a tropical storm, because many areas had 40+ inches of rain. And that's on top of the 50+ we saw in Harvey. So you need to be prepared. And the only way to prepare is to have flood coverage.
Jason, what's it like to go out and meet somebody who's had flood damage and doesn't have insurance? You've been on the front lines, you've seen it yourself. What's that like?
Yeah, thanks, Butch. Yeah, it's very difficult to have that tough conversation post-event or post-flood, just because you want to talk about the advantages of having flood insurance, because a lot of folks feel that if they're not in a special flood hazard area, they don't need flood insurance. And like Mark just indicated, homeowners insurance or standard homeowners policy does not cover flood. So it's very important to put that message and get that message out there. However, it's very difficult, post-event when you're talking to a homeowner or a survivor, if you will, that was heavily impacted by an event and they didn't have flood insurance. And so, yeah, luckily there at that time, this was a presidentially declared event. So you can talk about the other recovery programs within FEMA. However, a lot of times, like Mark and Butch also indicated, a flood event doesn't necessarily have to be a presidentially declared event. So when there's a flood, the only protection you would have is having flood insurance. And it's a very difficult conversation to have with a survivor or homeowner when they didn't take that opportunity to purchase flood insurance.
Caitlin, you've been on the private insurance side as a trainer and meeting with company experts and insurance agents and other people who deal specifically with clients. Tell us a little bit about why flood insurance and why you think it's important.
Well, thank you, Butch. So, like the NFIP is great at pointing out, if you live somewhere, it can rain, you live somewhere, it can flood. And unfortunately, items like a 200-year event or those talking items really give a misconception of the true risk of flooding. The maps themselves can be very outdated. They can give you a false sense of security about the risk. So we always recommend and have a flood talk. Is your community growing? Is there major construction projects in flight that is pouring concrete and taking up land that used to absorb the water, increasing the flood risk? And all of these compounded. I think about 4 years ago, Tampa was on national news because our freeway ramp had flooded almost 8 feet up the ramp in a basic rainstorm, and it was perpetuated by a basic construction project, and it flooded businesses all around that construction area. And so I'm sure those agents had that conversation about the flood risk with their clients, and the insured looks at the risk as of today, but there's many compounding factors that can increase your likelihood of experiencing a flood event, and that protection and the necessity of that protection is a conversation that's difficult to have because there's a misconception of how frequent flooding actually occurs. I think I saw a graphic that I always share with my sales and my agent partners that says, every state has experienced flooding. And that's important because a lot of people seem to think it's coastal. It's only in Hurricane Alley that this is happening, or a fluke incident in the Midwest, and that's not true. Flash flooding has been increasing. On the private side, we've been looking at the modeling, and there's been an increase in the severity and frequency of flooding at almost 5 times the rate it had been in the first 24 years of the program. And part of that is the development of communities and the concentration of people. And so the statistics haven't quite caught up, but with the engagement of the private market and the modeling we're looking at, we're uncovering some trends that really matter down at the local level that might be missed in that basic conversation an agent has with a client. So it always starts from us on an education standpoint on the importance and necessity of flood coverage.
Thanks, Caitlin. You bring up a good point. And I remember my very first flood. I was 4 years old. And believe it or not, I remember this vividly. I remember my mom going around and filling up the bathtubs. And this was Tropical Storm Agnes. And I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., over on the Maryland side. And Tropical Storm Agnes, for you youngins who don't remember, Agnes was a storm that basically sat over Pennsylvania, lower Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna River Valley for days and days and days, and just dropped tons of water. But it flooded all the way down into Washington, D.C., and there was significant flooding. I remember over my aunt's house that was fairly close by, or even a stream that wasn't very far from our home. And this was a far inland area. This was a tropical storm. But we were not, Washington, D.C. is not really considered a hurricane-prone area, but significant inland flooding. And we see this picture borne out time and time and time again from places that are not coastal, not subject to storm surge, but it's the rain events that really seem to impact as much as the traditional hurricane sorts of things that we worry about. Jason, let me ask you, can you describe the federal program a little bit? And what I want to do here in a minute is kind of contrast the federal program with what's offered by the private sector. So can you tell us a little bit about what's offered at the federal level with the NFIP? And then I'll have Caitlin and Mark kind of follow up on what else is available, or what some of the weaknesses are in the federal program, and what some of the strengths are in the private program, and so forth.
Sure, absolutely. So through the National Flood Insurance Program, there's various types of coverage. A policyholder can obtain residential coverage, which is 1 to 4 family coverage, non-residential commercial coverage for commercial buildings, contents coverage for renters, and then also condominium coverage. So for residential coverage, the limits are $250,000 for the building and $100,000 for the content. All right. For non-residential structures, that's $500,000 for the building and $500,000 for the contents. And then with a condominium policy, or a residential building association policy, also known as RCBAP, basically individual owners or the condominium association can purchase $250,000 for each unit in that particular building. So those are covers there. But keep in mind also, a lot of times we try to get the message out there that renters can also purchase flood insurance or purchase contents coverage for those buildings. So they can purchase a separate contents coverage as opposed to a structure coverage for those renters. And that's basically what we have on the NFIP. And then I'll defer to Caitlin for the private side.
Sure. So the private market is growing every day and offering more and more coverages. Specifically, there's been a demand, and that's where it's trying to fill the gap for more coverage in enclosures on post-storm elevated buildings, for the contents, basements, more comprehensive coverage for basements. And as any emerging market, it looks to aim towards ease of use, which similarly the NFIP is doing with First Grading 2.0. We don't require an elevation certificate, and we don't look at the modeling the same as the flood maps. It gets a little more granular because we're utilizing more modern technology to identify risk, drainage infrastructure down at the community level. Community planning and projects does go into the modeling. So private flood, in a few clicks now, agents can get a rate. So that's something that's kind of new and getting more engagement. But when it comes down to coverages, the limits can be higher. As we know, every home is around $250,000. They can cost much more to replace. So coverages can go as high as $5 million in many markets, including replacement costs on content. So it just gives more options in the free market and gives more private participation in this vital coverage.
So, Mark,
yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to build on that. One of the other advantages that consumers are seeing with private market flood insurers is less than a 30-day waiting period. That's a big point. That's another key issue that consumers don't understand. You can't go out and buy a NFIP policy for the storm that's coming this weekend. That's not possible. But there are some private insurers that have a much lesser period, grace period before the policy will take effect. So that has been an advantage for many looking at the market. And here in Florida, the Florida Office of Insurance Regulation has been working quite a bit with private flood writers to enter the market. They're making a strong marketing push on this to give Floridians more options on coverage, because the goal here in Florida is every homeowner to have a flood policy. Not that that's not the goal in other states, but here in Florida, a state that's so flood prone, that is the most prone to direct hurricane hits year after year. Statistically, that's a historical records there. You need to have flood protection. And the goal is, whether it's through NFIP or a private insurer, we want you to have flood coverage here in Florida.
So thanks, Mark. I neglected to point out at the very beginning, but somebody actually beat me to it. There is a question box over on the right-hand side, I think, of your screen. And I think it showed up as a little orange box for us, but you can type in questions there, and I will ask those questions of the panel. So we actually got one question already, and I think it's probably a good one to bring up at this point. Can we talk about affordability a little bit? Let's talk about, Jason, if you can talk a little bit about affordability, but also Caitlin or Mark, if you can talk about the affordability of the private policies, and just generally what policies are going to cost an individual. And I think a little bit later we have a question lined up on how we can save some money. So if we can just talk real briefly about affordability real quick.
Sure, I'll jump on that one. But so there are various factors that go into rating a policy, and a lot of that's going to change. I think someone alluded to a risk rating 2.0 that's going to take effect next year. But there are various factors that goes into rating a policy. With that being said, I mean, outside the special flood hazard area, if someone's located outside the special flood hazard area right now, they could generally get a policy for about maybe $400 to $500 with a preferred risk policy through the NFIP. Now, when you get into the various flood zones and the A zones and the B zones, that amount could probably go up if you go maximum coverage. So But you know, one thing we talk about affordability is pretty affordable. And one thing we always try to do is push folks over to the FloodSmartGov website, because they can go on that site and they can talk about the actual risk of where someone is, where a particular property is located, and also what type of it can get them in contact with different agents that may be able to write them a policy. One thing we like to also point out, that when you talk about policy through the NFIP, there's really not a shopping around piece like with other insurance coverage. You know, you can shop around. If you have a agent that's writing a policy and they're using the same factors for the same structure, that amount should be the same no matter what agent you go to. That's something we always want to point out. But again, you know, when we talk about those structures that are not inside the special flood hazard area, the rate could be pretty affordable with the preferred risk policy.
Mark, Caitlin, what about on the private side? I don't even know a whole lot about the private side flood insurance costs.
Yeah, I'll refer to Caitlin on this because she and her agency quote these policies, so I'll let her take the lead on that.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so the private market is offering a lot of rate relief, specifically because we don't use the elevation certificate for our programs, for example, to really drive the rate. We look at the individual risk factors. So it can provide more robust coverage, higher limits, and it can be cheaper than the NFIP. But it is important to note that the private market's not trying to take all of the risk. And there are clients out there, and this is a conversation we have with the training, that should stay with the NFIP because they experience subsidy that they could lose by moving to the private market, especially for pre-firm structures. And while they're in a glide path through the affordability plan in the program, they're not there yet, and they're still getting the benefit of that subsidy. So not everybody should be moving to the private market, but they certainly can look at it to see if the advanced coverages are a better fit for their individual needs. But the private market can be cheaper than the NFIP, and other times it's not, because some risks just aren't inside the appetite. Obviously, the NFIP takes on those right on the coast in the V zones with the full enclosures on their bottom floor. And in some instances, those model great, and they actually can be cheaper. So it's really down to the individual risk basis. But when it comes down to affordability, a lot of the quoting of the private is so easy to compare the two to see what's the best fit for your client is really the only way to determine as these markets are emerging. We do encourage everybody to keep in mind, if you're participating in a subsidy program through the NFIP, you could lose that. And it's true of any new markets, you know, there's some volatility. So you do want to keep that in mind as well. And we're very upfront with that conversation because there's definitely enough market here for everybody to participate. If they just have to be proactive and smart about how they go about it.
Thanks, Caitlin. Marcus, you've been very quiet so far, but we're going to put you on the spot. If I were a local emergency manager, I was a local mayor, I was police chief, fire chief, etc., what would I tell my citizens about the need for flood insurance? And are there any resources available to get that word out?
Thank you very much, Butch, and it's been a fascinating panel for me to be on. So if I was a local emergency manager, and thinking specifically about a few roles within the emergency management team, right? So if we're talking about specifically that local emergency manager, there's definitely some resources and opportunities to engage audiences, and some of the resources that we have available, right? So I know Jason did a wonderful job, and this is the work that he does every day. So he's able to rattle off what the different types of coverage policies are, what the mechanics are, but we actually have a few brochures and some easy to read, easy to follow things that talk about not just why buy flood insurance, but also what the benefits of flood insurance are. Another thing that I would consider, so keeping the emergency management agency in mind, you're going to have your social media manager. They're talking to the public every day. They're probably putting out content right now about hurricane preparedness season. We not only have infographics, but we also have some short animated videos, which we know typically gets a decent amount of engagement on social media. That again provides that nudge for people to not just think about flood insurance, but also see that it's actually attainable. One of the things that we know about some of the audiences, right? So some of the audiences that these folks are reaching, particularly the government official side, it's people that hadn't thought about flood insurance. I think to Mark's point earlier, right? For some people, they've bought the premium home insurance coverage and it's not even on their radar anymore. You have other people that didn't know they needed flood insurance for whatever reason. I'm from Tucson, Arizona. So if I move to Florida as an emergency manager, now I know what I need to do. But prior to, I wouldn't have thought about it. And then you have the other people who feel like they'll tell you something, and I'm sure we've all heard this. Well, I thought I didn't need flood insurance because I talked to one person or I had one conversation or I may be out of a map. And so for those folks that hadn't thought about it, I think the recommendation that I would make for those local government officials, first thing to do is just make sure that when you're talking about your flood preparedness messaging, there's some simple ways to include flood insurance as part of that conversation, and that's pointing to FloodSmart.gov. For those people that thought that they didn't know that they needed it, I think a part of that, some of the validators or establishers in the community. So a lot of emergency managers work with local faith leaders, local community-based leaders, empowering them with those tools to provide that message is going to be a good way to reach out to individuals and families who may not even have known that they needed it. And for the folks that thought that they didn't need it, that's where it's important for flood insurance agents and for insurance agents in particular to help reframe that conversation and try to validate the importance of making sure that you have complete coverage. We know that people need auto coverage, they need home coverage, and for people that are susceptible to flood risk, which is a majority of Americans, they need flood insurance. And so we do have some of the tools and resources to do that. And a lot of that information is located on FloodSmart.gov.
Hey, Tyler, would you mind throwing that slide up? There we go. So below that, you'll see a slide here for the stuff that the NFIP creates. The agents.floodsmart.gov is the site that Marcus was talking about, along with some of the other stuff. I'll explain the two different sites to you real quickly. Actually, Marcus, will you explain the two different sites to us real quickly again?
Absolutely.
Now that we see them in front of us.
Sure. So when we're talking about public facing, and that means for those emergency managers on the line, if you're talking about communicating to your public or publics, right? FloodSmart.gov, still the same site, has a lot of great information, not just on the program itself, but again, it also points to some of the preparedness measures you can take. So what we also know for government officials, so here I'm thinking about people who may interface with insurance agents, insurance associations, even some of our private flood partners. We've curated some resources specifically at agents.floodsmart.gov where you can get access to some of the social media posts, some of the same brochures, some of the same messaging that we develop and deploy and it's available for anyone to use. And so the key thing about agents.floodsmart.gov, that's also available to the public if you want to use it. The way that I often think about it is if I'm looking to communicate the value of flood insurance and I'm on the government side, I'm going to use the agents.floodsmart.gov/resources to get that information to help me communicate that message. But if I'm talking to my mom who thinks that I'm a flood insurance salesman, no matter how much I tell her I'm not, I'm going to point her to floodsmart.gov to make sure that she can understand what her flood risk is, what role she can take, why she needs to buy it, and to the extent that she wants to call other folks, how she can talk to her neighbors about it.
Thank you. And just as a complete aside, while you were talking, I noticed that the fire department in Duck, North Carolina, I was on their website this past week. The fire department in Duck, North Carolina is using FloodSmart stuff on their landing page on their website. We're also selling nice T-shirts if anybody needs a Duck Fire T-shirt. But if you go to duckfire.org, I noticed this week that they have one of our FloodSmart ads that they have pulled along with information about preparing for floods. So I thought that was actually kind of exciting. What's the best time to start telling this story about the need for flood insurance? When do I start having that conversation with people? I'll throw that out to anybody.
I'll tackle that one, but I think that conversation starts every time in the insurance side, at least when you speak to a client. They might have rejected it a few years ago, but you want to keep putting this conversation in front of them at the community level, I think it should happen whenever there's community outreach, just not during the high seasons. Obviously, before storm season is the best time to do a risk review. For example, Pinellas County, where I'm located, has a hurricane outreach for the whole community, normally at the community college every year. It's at the beginning of May. And flood is always a prominent conversation there before storm season has begun. And the community does a great job encouraging the locals to review their policies and make sure their coverage is up to date. They might have coverage, but they might not have enough coverage, and staying in front of that conversation. Because again, off standard season flooding, like for Florida, our prominent flooding occurs during hurricane season, but it doesn't mean we don't still have flooding events outside of that season. So.
Great, thank you.
I would just add to that. I would say that, yeah, I agree totally, and it really kind of goes to the geographical areas and when they're prone to have floods. You know, like in the hurricane-prone areas, you know, we normally see that during the hurricane season, so we start ramping up a lot of our communication. I know Marcus, he leads the communication outreach team, and he knows the various outreach campaigns, so he can speak to this. But I know during hurricanes or before hurricane season, we do a lot of outreach, you know, to those hurricane-prone states, you know, immediately, you know, late spring, right before June 1st. And then, you know, I know, Marcus, if you wanted to talk to some like the Midwest floods and when you all do the outreach for there, or the spring floods and things like that. But I think a lot of times it has to do with those. I think you all do a great job in looking to identify when certain areas are going to flood, so you can get out before that event and make sure we communicate or amplify the importance of flood insurance.
No, absolutely. So yeah, so we do definitely try to get to people before it's top of mind. And I actually want to share a quick story. So Butch and team were in Omaha, Nebraska at the Home and Garden Show earlier this year. Butch, I don't know if you want to chime in there, but I think when we first got there,
cold. It was cold in January in Omaha. That's what I want to say. It was dang cold.
It was cold and people were interested. And so, you know, we were there knowing we have spring flood season happening in March. There's an Omaha Home and Garden Show. It's really large. Butch and his team and NFIP Marketing and Outreach set up at the Home and Garden Show, but talked to some of the local newscasters. They talked to local agents. And for that particular community, Nebraska had massive floods the year before in March due to snowmelt flood risk, right? Or due to different types of flooding and rainstorms. And so they knew tangentially that they were going to talk about it, right? So we know that local media is going to give their message, but Butch and his team did a great job of making sure to make it practical and accessible to say like, hey, look, you don't have to wait until the rain starts coming until purchasing a flood insurance policy. And with the Omaha Home and Garden Show, typically people there are looking to invest and protect their property in different ways. So it was very much a time where we said, okay, we have enough data and information because of our private sector partners, nonprofit partners, other federal government partners, of typically when the flood rains or when flooding starts to peak. So let's pick some time before that when it's going to be on top of mind for folks to think about flood risk. Butch, is there anything else you wanted to share in terms of just what you learned in Omaha and kind of what some of the things were? There are some great interviews out there on that effort, but I think that was a good example of communicating flood risk a bit earlier before flood season actually started.
Well, thanks, Marcus. And actually, it leads me to a different direction. And Mark kind of touched on it, but I want to make sure that we talk about it a little bit. Mark, can you discuss the 30-day wait period that I require versus what's required on the private side for flood insurance? And just make sure if people aren't familiar with the whole 30-day wait, that we discuss that for just a moment.
Right. Well, the important thing that the III always stresses is you need to plan ahead, and that's for all types of catastrophes. But with flood, if you are interested in adding a national flood insurance program policy to your portfolio of other coverages that you might have for your home, you need to do it before the storm warnings are issued, because no matter what time of year, there is a 30-day waiting period for an NFIP program, policy to take effect. But there are some private insurers now that have reduced that time frame. Some, from what my understanding is, and maybe Caitlin has some specific details, but some are 7 to 10 days, some are 14 days. So there is a possibility to get covered sooner, but once again, you can't wait until the National Weather Service says there's a tropical storm watch or a hurricane watch coming your way. Because not only could you not get your flood policy in time, there's going to be a moratorium for you to even make changes to your property policy. So you can't wait till the last minute. You need to prepare. And Caitlin's message a few minutes ago about doing an annual insurance review is so important to make sure not only what kind of coverages you have, but how much coverage you have. So if you have a devastating, catastrophic loss to your home, you are fully protected. This is all about financial protection for the homeowner.
That is great advice, Mark. I'm gonna go off script for just a minute, and because I think you said something important there. What kind of tools are available for people to do an audit of their home insurance, their auto insurance, and then are there tools available for consumers to track their stuff as far as, you know, if you've got expensive antiques, or you've got expensive electronics, or you've got an expensive collection of whatever. I have an expensive cigar collection that I enjoy, and
Exactly.
you know, are there ways for me to sort of take pictures of that? I don't even know what to take a picture of. My furniture, my TV. What do you care about? What does an insurance company care about when it comes to claims time, and what kind of tools are available on the private side or public side to look at that?
Many property casualty carriers now have tools on their websites to create a home inventory, where you could do a digital home inventory, include photos, include video of all your possessions, because you want to have a record of that. If it comes to the point where you need to make a storm claim, this will make the process so much easier to file that claim. That's essential. And then your first question was just about the insurance review process. One thing that all consumers could do is look at what's called the declaration page of your insurance policy. That's usually the front page of your policy. That will explain what your coverage is, what your deductibles are. It gives you all the fingertip information right there, so you have a good understanding of how much coverage you have. You know, for example, with hurricane deductibles, that could be a significant amount, up to 5% of your property value. So you need to understand that you need to pay that hurricane deductible if there's wind damage, for example, on your home. So that gives you a familiar, I guess, overview of your policy. But we recommend talk with your insurance agent. Get on the phone. This is a great time. We really haven't hit the heart of the season's just begun. We know the peak of the season's a couple of months down the road, typically from mid-August through mid-October. Now's the time to check everything if you haven't done so already. Make sure you are financially prepared.
So related question then, I know it's not just my house that's going to get wet, but my car is going to get wet, my shed's going to get wet, my riding lawnmower is going to get wet. Can you talk about the coverages for those kinds of things? And specifically, I'm worried about my truck, and I still need to get to work if I was actually working off site. But I got 3 vehicles out in the driveway. I got my wife's car and the kid's car. What do I do about those things?
You need to take a look, once again, at your declaration page for your auto policy and see if you have an option that's called comprehensive coverage. About 80% of US consumers do take that option, add it to their auto policy. And comprehensive is everything but collision. That means a tree falling on the car, flood damage to the vehicle, fire damage to the vehicle, vandalism to the vehicle, everything but collision. So especially for hurricane season, you really need to have comprehensive coverage because there's a good chance of water damage to your vehicle. We look at the thousands of vehicles that were destroyed in the Houston area during Harvey, for example. I mean, just wiped out neighborhoods of vehicles sitting on the street because of the vast amount of flooding that we saw there. And comprehensive, like I said, only about 80% take it. That means 20% are vulnerable to a flood event destroying their vehicle.
Jason, there's been a couple of questions over in the chat about back kind of on the affordability issue. What would you tell either a homeowner or a community official how to lower insurance rates for flood, specifically the NFIP, but anything else you can address. How do I save some money? Are there ways that that you can recommend for me to look at, or places I can go and learn more about saving some money on flood insurance?
Absolutely, absolutely. Local officials can assist their constituents or the policyholders in their community by lowering their flood insurance rate. By one, they could just recommend that, when they do, because local officials are kind of like the first line, and they engage very heavily with the community and the residents in their communities. So they're kind of like our first line, and they speak a lot to the flood insurance. So they do a good job of conveying our flood insurance message. But what they can do is make sure that when they do build their structures, they elevate them, or they build them above what we call the base flood elevation, or BFE. That right there is that could reduce the actual cost of a flood insurance policy. So various mitigation options, if you will, or going above and beyond the minimum requirements. Also, what communities can do is they can enroll in what we call the community rating system. So all NFIP participating communities have the option to enroll in the community rating system. And basically, these communities agree to go above and beyond the NFIP minimum standards. Right now, we have about 1,500 or so communities that participate in the community rating system nationwide. We have about 500 or so that are actually located in Region 4 of the Southeast states. And so what they do is, it's kind of like if you're familiar with the fire rating program, it's a rating program where for every points that a community receives, they go down a level. So they start at a class 10 and they go down, and for every level that they go down, starting with a class 9, they get a 5% discount, or I'm sorry, the policyholders in the community receive a 5% discount. So policyholders can experience a 5% discount in a class 9 all the way up to a 45% discount on their flood insurance policies for a class 4. So community officials really understand how much of a role they can play in assisting their constituents and their policyholders by enrolling in the community rating system. Again, like I mentioned, there's only 1,500 or so communities throughout nationwide that participate. And a lot of times, most NFIP participating communities, they're doing a lot of things already that would easily get them in the program with a class 8 or 9. But that right there can assist. It can assist them and directly provide benefits to the policyholders in their community if they enroll and participate in the community rating system.
So Region 4 communities that happen to be on the chat, Jason's email will be up in a few minutes, and he actually, it's his team that takes care of that. So for the Region 4 states, and if anybody is in a Region 6 state or Region 3 state needs to know a little bit more about that, reach out to me and I'll hook you up with the right people. Marcus, you're back on the hot spot. Who needs to be talking about flood insurance? We talk about fire chiefs, police chiefs, and emergency management officials and those types, but who else can be talking about flood insurance?
Absolutely. So I think one person, probably the person that you most often see talking about flooding, is going to be every night or in the afternoon, which is going to be your local media outlets and your meteorologists. And so what we've seen and we appreciate, right, is when those local news stations include some information about flood risk and flood insurance as part of talking about flood risk. So those are people that may establish the role that flood insurance has there. Some other folks that from there, you talk about people who establish. In terms of validators, we think about realtors, right? So you have organizations like the National Association of Realtors, people that are looking to make sure that people find their next home. And as part of that conversation in the home buying process, they encourage it, and we see from the National Association of Realtors continued encouragement of having that conversation about the role that flood insurance has as protecting the investments that you've built. In terms of building investments, so you see a lot of information right now about financial preparedness, financial literacy, being financially safe. We know and understand that not everybody has access to a financial advisor in a professional sense, but we do see a lot more organizations taking on the role of providing free services and information for folks about the financial aspects. And specifically, I'm thinking about some of the financial counselors and financial planners that are validating from that perspective. Let's get a bit more personal though, right? So I think, Butch, you raised a good example with firefighters and police chiefs, right? It's going to be those local first responders oftentimes that folks don't think about also being validators. in talking about flood insurance. And so I think about those communities that are affected by flood risk after a wildfire. In one of our survivor story videos, we actually feature some first responders, and one of them, a firefighter in particular, who had just validated for folks and established like, hey, look, we suffered significant damage from this wildfire. And a lot of community members, again, they either didn't know or didn't think that they needed to take on flood insurance as part of some of the additional subsequent flood risk. And then for faith leaders, for community-based leaders, again, there's enough accessible information that even if you aren't a flood insurance expert and you're not an insurance agent and you just generally care about the health and safety and well-being of others, having that common preparedness conversation about, having your plan, there's enough information out there, and we can make some more available that talks about practically how having that conversation about flood insurance should be a part of that plan as well. And it's actually something that we have seen more of our faith-based and community-based partners active in disaster doing, where they're reinforcing that message that, we want you to be prepared, we want your family to be safe, and we also want you to protect the life that you build. And so having that flood insurance process is very much part of what it looks like being prepared for flood risk.
Marcus, you came out of the VOAG community. Is anybody in the VOAG community, are they stepping up, or are there ways for the VOAG community to step up? I know, for example, the Red Cross is seen as a kind of a trusted partner in communities, Salvation Army, other kinds of community organizations like that. Are there ways for those guys to get involved?
There absolutely is, and we are seeing some of that trend locally, and it's scaling up nationally. So I think about Habitat for Humanity, organization that does great work post-disaster. They have on their national website, they talk about flood risk and talk about the importance of flooding. And again, if they're building homes for families that have been damaged by floods, it's appreciative that you have partners like that talking about that as well. I think some unconventional partners in the faith-based space that people may not often think about is liability and insurance is still a key thing. And so for your deacons, for your trustees, for those folks that are very invested in the financial aspects of the equation, that's a really receptive audience that as a local emergency manager, local government official, you pass by those different houses of worship, very large infrastructures, talking to the pastor to say, hey, I know you're busy, but let's have a conversation. Is there somebody that I can talk with that's managing your finances so I can just articulate and then make sure, and oh, by the way, here's some information from your congregation. So that's where we're seeing some of those examples play out. And those are also some tips of other partners to engage as well. But yeah, Habitat for Humanity, Red Cross, the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster as a whole are great partners. One specific partner, Operation Hope, actually worked with FEMA, Butch, to your point about financial preparedness, to develop the emergency financial first aid kit with the purpose of helping people kind of think through, how do I take inventory of all the things in my home? So those can be great complements to the resources that Mark mentioned earlier.
Do you happen to know that website for that financial preparedness thing you just mentioned?
I do. So you can get it on ready.gov /financial-preparedness. We also point back to the financial preparedness in the ready.gov website on FloodSmart.gov. So we know that there are dozens and dozens of federal government websites for everything flood risk related. We have that information on FloodSmart.gov under the preparedness tab.
Caitlin or Mark, I'm gonna put you on the spot. Speaking about financial preparedness, how is insurance part of your financial preparedness? How does insurance play into that?
Well, you look at your home, in most cases, that's going to be the biggest financial asset a consumer has. I mean, we talk about home values, we talk about, flood insurance levels and home values. It could be several $100,000 or more, your home. You put a major investment in that. You're paying off your mortgage on that for 15 or 30 years. You're continuing to invest in that property by doing that. You need to make sure you have the proper level of insurance to protect those assets. And that's what insurance coverage is all about. That's property coverage, that's flood coverage, that's auto coverage, because those vehicles are also investments, significant investment. But you talked about your truck. That's a significant investment for you and is for millions of Americans around the country, trucks and cars. You need to think of all those assets and make sure you are financially protected from losses for all kinds of reasons.
Caitlin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So we used to have a marketing piece that was quite effective that said, which check would you rather write? And in that checkbook, it would show the average cost of a flood policy specifically compared to the cost of just 2 inches of water in a home. And it was a very impactful marketing piece because it very quickly identified the true cost associated around this peril, and other insurances can benefit from that same conversation piece as well. It's very easy to think about not being able to afford that insurance policy, but at the same time, it's a cost of living that maybe you can't afford not to have. So we found that was a very impactful way to start the conversation about protecting your largest investment. A lot of people seem to think, like we discussed before, disaster assistance will come in and pay for everything, and that's a loan. And it's a loan that's not guaranteed because it does require the president to declare a disaster, and that is not always the case around flooding events. And so there's a lot of misconceptions in the market about there being a safety net that's really not there, or it's at least not guaranteed, and it's not enough to make you whole again. So when it comes to the financial costs around the investments and the insurance of those investments, we found that was a pivotal conversation starter.
So just follow up. I had to pull this number for something else. The average FEMA individual assistance payment in Harvey, this is Texas in 2017, average IA payment was $5,153.24. The average NFIP claims payment in Harvey, same storm, was $117,487. So you've got $5,100 versus $117,000. So that just paints a pretty stark picture about how much is available in aid. And Caitlin makes a good point, is that most of that aid from the federal government at least comes back in very ordinary terms. This is a second mortgage on your house that you weren't really expecting to have to pay. Caitlin, you brought up a point when we were preparing for this, and I kind of want to chase it down. We just saw in Michigan a couple of weeks ago, during the middle of all this, a series of dam failures, completely unexpected dam failures. Apparently, I won't go into the politics of it, but it looks like that the dams may have been de-accredited and a variety of other things. But an awful lot of people were caught off guard. What are your thoughts on that? What kind of lessons can we learn from those kinds of disasters where people are completely caught off guard, thinking a levee is going to survive or thinking a dam is going to survive, and then all of a sudden Mother Nature has other plans?
Oh, great question. And that really comes down to understanding your community and the risks, and really understanding how recently they were mapped, because that also gives you a false sense of security. There's been conversations going on nationwide about crumbling infrastructure and the risk of living near a dam, but it's not always trickling down to the individual level. And it certainly is a pivotal conversation point for agents to be having. And what happened on our end, because like Mark pointed out before, we don't have a long waiting period. Our waiting period is 7 days. If you have a loan closing, there's no waiting period. If you've had a map revision in the last 60 days that took you over to high risk, there's no wait period. So there are some alternatives to coverage, and of course, knowing the NFIP requires a 30-day wait. As soon as people were concerned about the failure of that dam, my phone line started to increase in frequency, asking if they could find coverage. And I had that uncomfortable conversation with the agents to explain to them that the policy form follows the NFIP, and that is considered a flood in progress. There is a direct imminent threat and danger of flooding. So that is a known peril about to occur and loss. And so coverage wouldn't apply. You might be able to get a policy effective before then, but that flooding event is technically not covered. And so that comes down to the timing of that conversation and making sure it's an understanding. Insurance is an investment that you're not going to gamble to roll the dice when a threat occurs to your property. And so that was a difficult conversation I had to have. And on the private market, we've certainly had those, and I know the NFIP has. I've been on those calls as well, where there's a lawsuit because the insured had a policy and they managed to get it in place but didn't understand the rules about a flood in progress. And that's something to also understand is your community doesn't always have the threat during the high storm seasons. I want to say around 6 years ago at Random City in Maryland that had never had a flood before, had torrential rainfall, and the whole city flooded with no warning whatsoever. And this conversation was sparked.
Twice in that city.
Yes, I did. You're right.
Yeah, I actually live near there, so yeah.
I mean, building on that, you have to ask yourself, Butch, you just had the data. Could you afford to pay $117,000 to repair your home out of your pocket? I mean, that's the question that consumers have to ask. Can I afford that? Even in a lesser year, 2018 data that the III has, the average loss for flood was about $45,000, I believe. And even then, can you afford the 45, let alone the 117 from Harvey? Versus spending, in most cases, what's the average in your other panelists could verify this, an NFIP policy, the national average, what is about 650? Is that
$700? Yeah.
Okay, 700, right? Okay. So just think of the premium you pay into that versus what the potential loss could be out of pocket. That's what you have to look at.
Hey, Jason. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, it comes down to having that conversation change at all levels, from are you required to have this coverage, which really spurns the flood talk these days, to are you protected against this peril? And that's just a shift in the mindset. And I just wanted to add to that, one caveat of the NFIP is it doesn't include additional living expense either. So those people that experience that not only had devastating loss to their property, they have nowhere to go and no additional funds to rebuild or to live somewhere else as they rebuild because their home's no longer habitable. So a lot of that disaster payment that limited from Harvey to around $5,000 went towards just getting back on their feet, not actually restoring their property. And I think that's a critical conversation piece to have as well. Of why you want to have the insurance, because at least as you can absorb the cost of living somewhere else, you'll have insurance to rebuild your home.
So Caitlin brings up a personal point to me, and I will tell this story more as a warning to everyone. We had a toilet line burst in our house in the master bedroom. Now, we live in a small 4-bedroom colonial built in 1971. Fairfax County, Virginia. It's not a big mansion by any means. And so the little 12-inch toilet line between the wall and the toilet burst. It was one of those little foil wrapped ones. They're probably in most houses. And the water ran for probably an hour before one of the neighbors noticed that it was actually pouring out the underneath the siding. And we've got floor vents for the HVAC. There's floor vents. That is one big drain. So it obviously spread throughout the entire first floor. If you can imagine this 1971 construction, the house was full of asbestos. And so we had not only an insurance claim, but an asbestos claim. At the end of the day, we were out of the house 6 weeks, and $80,000 was the final claims payment. And 3 small kids, 2 dogs, a cat, and whatever else. And so we ended up camping for that summer. I just saw it on Facebook pop up again. I think it was 2012. Like I say, for 6 weeks over at the Residence Inn behind the house. And our insurance paid for the entire thing. I think we were out $500 for the deductible. So I use that as a warning story that, yeah, it really can happen and can be a huge expense. And trust me, the kids love the pool for those weeks. And we got the free breakfast, but the insurance took care of everything. And if you're ever think that it can't happen, it really absolutely can. And for something as simple as a toilet line bursting. Jason, I want to ask you a question. Tell me about, and Caitlin sort of touched on it a moment ago, but tell me about the biggest misconceptions and myths about risk. I know we were dancing around about this yesterday, and there's a big tropical storm headed towards Louisiana, and I actually did a little quick research on flood insurance not required. Somebody on the National Flood Conference panel yesterday had an interesting slide. It was a real estate sign put in front of somebody's front yard, and there was a little hanger on the bottom of it that said flood insurance not required. So talk a little bit about the whole idea of flood risk and in and out and special flood hazard areas and zones and all that. What does that mean, and what does it really mean?
Yeah, thanks, Butch. So really, when we talk about one of the biggest misconceptions in the program, we talk about not required versus not needing it. And so a lot of times, if through the mandatory purchase requirement, any federally backed loan in the special flood hazard area, or that area, that A or B zone, or the high risk zone, they're required to have flood insurance for that, if in order for the lender to write that loan, right? So it's required through the mandatory purchase requirement. However, for those that, and that leads to misconception where those that are outside of that high risk zone, it's not, the flood insurance is not required, but it's still needed. It's still, we still would recommend those outside the special flood hazard area, to purchase flood insurance. And that goes back to what I mentioned earlier with the preferred risk policy. For those outside of that special flood hazard area, they can get a pretty affordable preferred risk policy for about $400 or $500. But a lot of times folks feel like if they're not, and they get to the closing table, or like Butch mentioned, you have a real estate sign that shows that flood insurance not required, that kind of somewhat alleviates the risk for those potential buyers. And that's not necessarily the case, because something we normally like to joke with is that water does not know how to read a flood map. It doesn't necessarily mean that, as soon as it gets to this A zone, X zone border, it's just going to stop and it's going to go back the other way. That's not necessarily the case. And so we still recommend that individuals outside the special flood hazard area purchase a flood insurance policy. Another misconception that we oftentimes find post-event is that local residents feel that, they could not purchase flood insurance because they weren't in a special flood hazard area. And we often like to make sure everyone understands that anyone can purchase flood insurance if their community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so if that community, in which we have over 23,000 communities that participate, though, anyone can purchase flood insurance in that particular community, and it is available. So those are misconceptions there, and we go, oftentimes we release new flood maps, and we may have a structure that was located in the special flood hazard area. However, new maps are coming out, and for some reason, the structure is no longer reflected in the special flood hazard area. That doesn't necessarily move the risk. So we still recommend that a policyholder in that particular case maintain their flood insurance policy. So it's basically just in explaining that, although you're not identified in the high risk zone or the special flood hazard area on the map, you still have a possibility of flooding, and therefore flood insurance would be recommended, highly recommended.
All right. Yes. Thank you. All right. Last question. We'll open it up for questions, and we might give people some time back if they need it. I was looking at a different question. Given that a lot has changed over the last few months, and by pretty much any measure, 2020 has basically sucked for a lot of people. I was reading an interesting article, I think it was from the New York Times this morning, about 2020 being the worst year since 1968. And I take that personally because I was born in 1968. But as far as, you've got the murder of George Floyd, you've got riots and protests and racial tensions. You've got 100,000 plus people who have died of COVID. Many more have been impacted by that. You've got cities and countries just starting to emerge, or cities and states just starting to emerge from being locked down. You've got economic issues. You've got the stock market. A lot of people took huge losses, myself included. My retirement account back in March and April. Isn't it a little tone deaf for us to be talking about insurance right now when people are struggling to make ends meet and people are just getting back to work and joblessness is over 4 million Americans? Who the hell do we think we are talking about insurance right now? I'll throw that out.
I'll jump in on it because we've been asked this subject by many media outlets have asked us this over the past few weeks. And we feel here at the III, it's more important than ever to be financially protected. With all of these other issues facing us, we still have significant impacts of the pandemic in markets across the country. Civil disorder we've seen over the last week or so in many areas that unfortunately caused some destruction, particularly in some major cities. And that also our insurance losses, which will be covered by the industry. That's a very important point to make, that the insurance industry is here to protect its policyholders for all types of losses. And as we are now into hurricane season, the insurance industry is financially positioned to support its policyholders in all areas that will be impacted by hurricanes. The industry right now has about $800 billion in surplus. Reserves are strong to cover all claims, and that's what we do. That's what our job is here in the property casualty industry, paying claims, supporting our policyholders, and we're ready for that. So the conversation needs to be heard, even though it's a very difficult time to talk about it.
Jason, what do you think about that?
Sorry, I'm trying to get to the mute button here. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're working right now to, the risk is still going to be, I mean, we're in this environment where we have to be prepared. The risk is there especially as we approach hurricane season. It sounds like we're going to have an active season. And then in the agency, we're working to identify how do we deliver our programs, our post-disaster programs in a COVID environment. I mean, that's something we're really working on because we know that two things are certain. We still have to deliver our programs, and we're in a post-COVID environment. So we're looking at ways to do that, and see what goes there. We've recently modified the way we deliver our claims process in the COVID environment. We actually have a remote process for filing or for processing flood insurance claims. That's something that we worked on, and so I think I want to say maybe we've done about maybe 500 or so. Quote me if I'm wrong. Help me out if I'm wrong. But yeah, that's something we're doing. Just trying to figure out how do we deliver our programs in the COVID environment, because right now we know that the risk is still there and we have to be prepared.
Caitlin, what do you think about that? Is it the wrong time to be talking about insurance right now, given 1,000 other things going on in the world?
Unfortunately not, because it always thunders when it rains, and it's always the possibility of it compounding even more. Specifically, I'm down here in Florida, and I keep seeing the reports too of a more active than ever hurricane season predicted, and there's a lot of people needing rate relief, and the economic pressures that they're experiencing from what's happening in our economy is a vital conversation. And for many insureds, they're reaching out to their agents and they're having a conversation about extensions, which many states have afforded on the renewal payments. But at the same time, it's also a great opportunity to discuss coverage and alternative markets for rate relief and what you can do and what your options are. And as we're all sitting at home still or working in our office or trying to hit a new normal, it's the right conversation to be having where you sit down and reassess. And I think it's opened a lot of eyes. So while it's very stressful and there's a lot of mounting issues happening every day, it's unfortunately also starting a conversation that needs to be had. The hurricanes happen every year. There's always outreach happening at the community level. and it's a surround sound, all hands on deck kind of conversation that needs to happen. So no, I think it's not tone deaf. It's unfortunately it needs to be addressed, and hopefully for some it can provide some relief or identify coverages that are missing.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hey, Marcus, how has the NFIP changed, or has the NFIP changed its messaging this year for hurricane season versus past years, and what's being done differently?
Thank you for that, Butch. So one of the things that we're looking at, and I think you're seeing this across all sectors when they talk about messaging and communication, is in the situated way, providing that right customer insurance. So we don't want to be tone deaf about what we're delivering, but there are some things that we do want to affirm, right? I think one of the first things with the customer insurance messaging is reinforcing that we will be there, and that the NFIP program is a program that's available to people who are looking to protect their financial investments. I think similar to what Mark is talking about, we know that many of the emergency managers on the call, I mean, we just heard the hazards, right? There's the biological hazard, there's the man-made hazard, there's some natural hazards, and then there's the hazards that we don't know about just yet. But what we do know as emergency managers is we have partners and we have options. And that's very much what we're looking to work alongside with the NFIP program to help communicate to customers and policyholders and people who, again, may not even really thought about flood insurance at this point, that there will be some additional messaging that rolls out as part of this hurricane season. It's very conscious of the situation and context that many of our families and our neighbors and our friends find themselves in. We know that we can communicate and engage with compassion. We can do it with empathy, but we all have an obligation as servants and community servants to the public to make sure that we're practical, actionable, and honest about what the risks are. And so that's something that we are committed to supporting the NFIP with and their messaging for hurricane season. And it's been great to see partners from across sectors making sure that they are of best help in communicating the right message to the right partners at the right time during this very difficult time.
And right now, it seems, to me more than ever, I have been out of my house. I've gone to Walmart and I've gone to the grocery store, but I haven't been a lot further than that since God knows when. I think March 13th or 15th, somebody said. And we've worn through our wood floors already. We've decided that we need to replace the wood floors and probably need to replace a couple of couches. And we've watched every episode of Tiger King and what's the other, Ozark. We enjoyed Ozark in our house on Netflix. Well, we watched an awful lot of TV. We've had a lot of family dinners. We've learned to cook a lot of things, a lot of new things. And I think I see some heads nodding, so I assume that other people are in agreement. But it's interesting to me, and I really realized, how important my home is to the kind of the safety of our family. And I think one of the most effective messages that I've seen lately is, now more than ever, our home is truly our sanctuary and may continue to be. We don't know exactly what COVID's going to do next and whether or not we'll see a resurgence here as the guard comes down a little bit and the states start to reopen. But I think more than ever, we may have to come back to this, or sometime in the future, we're going to have to come back to our homes. And I think protecting them now, not only flood, but also other kinds of insurance that Mark and Caitlin have talked about. I think that's a more important discussion than ever, is ensuring that we've got a place to go back to. One of the things, and I'm sure most of the participants on the call have seen, is the new FEMA guidance for sheltering and congregate care in a COVID environment. And one of the things that FEMA is pretty clear about is your home may be your safest place this year in hurricane season because congregate care sheltering is going to look very different this year. We're going to have fewer volunteers able to come out because of COVID. A lot of those people who volunteer in shelters, and I've been to hundreds of shelters in my career, a lot of those people are senior citizens. They may not be as willing to come out. Things like cooked meals may not be a thing in shelters. We may be depending on a lot more on prepackaged meals, those kinds of things. We're going to have to set up cots 6 feet apart. And all of those kinds of things really mean that our home, as long as it's safe to stay there, is going to be more important. And if our home has some damage, it's going to be a lot more important to rebuild that as quickly as possible. And I think that's one of the messages that we can do as people who care about, and I will speak for myself and I think everybody on the panel. What we really care about is, and I'm not an insurance guy. I didn't sign up to work at FEMA because I cared about insurance. I signed up because I cared about people and keeping people safe. But one of the things that, I think all of us on the panel can agree about is what we really care about is ensuring that people have a place where they can lay their head safely at the end of the day and maintain that. I think that's the conversation that we all probably can agree that we should be having now even more than ever, and especially when it comes to an active hurricane season and active floods. Anybody else have any final thoughts that they want to throw in?
Well, yeah, I'll give a quick follow-up to Butch on the sheltering situation this year. The state of Florida, the Division of Emergency Management here in Florida, is contracting with hotels around the state to use as shelters, only when necessary, as you said. Primarily, it's probably going to be in your home this year, but if they need to move people out of communities, they are in the process of contracting with hotels all across the state, which is really important. So people, if they have to go, there will be a place for them.
And that's going to look very, very different than in past years, where the high school gym or the basement of the church is no longer going to be able to be used for a congregate care shelter. So, and I think one of our recommendations in that I read an early draft of it. I haven't read the final, but I think one of our recommendations is, unless you have to evacuate, stay home. Unless you're really ordered by your local officials. And I think that's one of the really shows how important our home is as our sanctuary and how important it is to protect it. So to Mark and Jason and Caitlin and Marcus and Tyler, who's working the slides in the background, thank you all. This has been a great panel and I've enjoyed it. And we've had, it's interesting. I see the little, there it is. I can see the little attendance numbers over on the side, and we haven't lost anybody, which is fantastic. And so that means that everything, all the wisdom and knowledge you guys have imparted, all of you, has been fantastic, and people have gotten some value on it. If you look at the session contact information slide that Tyler's got up, you'll see all of our email addresses. You can hit us up on Twitter too. I think that may be somewhere, I'm not sure, but certainly be more than happy to answer any questions. Now you can send them over in the little box over on the side, or certainly hit us up on email. We are glad to help. Make sure you visit FloodSmart.gov and agents.floodsmart.gov. And otherwise, we will let you get back to your conference. And certainly for all the 55, 60 people that have been online, we appreciate your time and attention to this important topic as well.
And one closing thought, I just want to give a little teaser. This afternoon at 3:30 p.m., the III will be presenting a hurricane preparedness session. And as part of that, we will include an updated seasonal forecast from Phil Klotzbach and the Colorado State University team. And you'll want to pay attention to that because there are changes to the forecast. That's the teaser I'll give you right now.
I'm hoping you're not going to tell us it's going to be worse.
I have no comment at this time.
All right, fair enough. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Caitlin. It's been great joining you all for this morning. Audience, thank you for joining us, and we will be in touch throughout the summer, I'm sure. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.